During the wedding, as the string quartet played softly in the background, my son's beautiful bride leaned in close. Her immaculate white veil brushed against my cheek as she whispered, "Get out of here and do not come back. You are not welcome here, you clueless old fool." I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I simply smiled, adjusted my suit jacket, and said, "Okay, Valerie, but I will take some others with me." When she realized exactly who was walking out the door behind me, she let out a scream of absolute horror that stopped the music dead in its tracks. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who completely underestimated your worth. But to understand how a 76-year-old father ended up walking out of a lavish wedding, he paid for we have to go back exactly 5 months. My name is William Kensington. I am 76 years old, and I spent my entire life building a commercial real estate empire right here in Chicago. I did not inherit a single dime from anyone. Back in the early 1970s, I started with nothing but a rusted-out pickup truck, a heavy metal toolbox, and a relentless drive to succeed. I poured my sweat, my blood, and my youth into concrete and steel, slowly turning empty dirt lots into towering corporate office buildings. When my wife passed away 10 years ago, my focus shifted entirely to securing a lasting legacy for our only child, Jason. Jason is 32 years old now. He is incredibly intelligent when it comes to financial spreadsheets and corporate profit margins. But he has always possessed one dangerous flaw. He is desperately eager to prove himself to be accepted by the upper crust of high society, and to show the world he is more than just a blue-collar builder's son. I stepped down as Chief Executive Officer 3 years ago, handing him the daily operations of Kensington Properties, hoping the heavy responsibility would mature him. Instead, the sudden power simply made him a very visible target. That was when Valerie entered the picture. Jason brought her to our Sunday family dinner one evening, practically glowing with pride. Valerie claimed to be 29 years old. She possessed the polished accent, the expensive designer clothes, and the perfectly manicured appearance of generational old money. Jason introduced her as a European tech heiress, the youngest daughter of a prominent family, with massive estates scattered across the continent. At first glance, she was undoubtedly charming. She complimented my home, asked polite questions about my past projects, and seemed entirely devoted to my son. But after 40 years of negotiating with cutthroat property developers and ruthless city politicians, you develop a reliable sixth sense for people. When Valerie looked at Jason, I did not see genuine love in her eyes. I saw cold calculation. I saw a hungry predator evaluating a very lucrative meal. Still, Jason was completely mesmerized by her illusion. Within 6 months, he proposed to her with a diamond ring that cost more than my first 3 houses combined. 5 months before the wedding, the real trouble began. Jason came over to my house on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. He was wearing a sharp, tailored suit, carrying a thick leather folder securely under his arm. He looked nervous but highly determined. He sat down at my kitchen table, slid the heavy folder toward me, and proudly announced that he and Valerie were signing a prenuptial agreement. He wanted me to look it over just to put my old-fashioned protective worries to rest once and for all. I slowly opened the folder. On the surface, the legal document looked flawlessly professional. It stated that Jason's massive shares in Kensington Properties would remain entirely his, while Valerie's massive international assets would be strictly protected by her family's private offshore trust. It seemed completely fair. It seemed like the responsible, mature action of 2 wealthy adults merging their complicated lives. Jason sat across from me, drinking a cup of black coffee, beaming as if he had just solved a complex mathematical puzzle. "See, Dad," he said, his voice full of defensive pride. "I told you Valerie is not after my money. Her family trust is worth triple what our entire company brings in annually. She insists on keeping everything entirely separate. You can stop treating her like a gold digger now." I nodded slowly, putting on my reading glasses. I told him I was just being a cautious father looking out for his boy. I read through the first 10 pages without saying a single word. But as a man who has spent half a century agonizing over strict zoning permits, complex municipal codes, and tricky contractor agreements, my eyes are highly trained to catch subtle anomalies. I do not just read the bold print. I read the fine print, the hidden margins, the tiny footnotes. When I finally reached page 14, a section detailing the legal jurisdiction of Valerie's so-called European wealth, my index finger stopped abruptly on a specific paragraph. It listed the managing legal firm of her family trust, a prestigious-sounding entity named Vanguard Heritage Holdings, supposedly headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. But there was a glaring, almost microscopic error on the page. The street address for this elite Swiss financial institution was misspelled. They had used the American spelling of a French word, and the postal code format was entirely wrong for that specific region of Europe. I did not say a word to Jason. If I raised a suspicion right then and there, he would have exploded in anger. He would have accused me of trying to sabotage his happiness out of spite, and Valerie would have easily smoothed the situation over as a simple clerical error made by a junior lawyer. I needed concrete facts. I needed undeniable hard proof before I made my next move. So I took off my glasses, closed the leather folder, and handed it back to my son with a warm, approving smile. "It looks completely solid, Jason," I told him, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "You made a very, very smart decision, and I am truly happy for you both." He looked visibly relieved. The defensive tension left his shoulders, and he hugged me tightly before heading back to the corporate office, completely unaware of the dark storm brewing in my mind. The exact moment I heard his car pull out of the driveway, my friendly facade dropped. I walked straight into my home office, locked the heavy wooden door behind me, and sat down at my mahogany desk. I booted up my computer. My hands were perfectly steady as I pulled up the International Business Registry databases I used to use for verifying overseas material suppliers. I typed in the exact corporate registration number and the name Vanguard Heritage Holdings. The global search took less than 2 minutes to complete. The official results loaded onto my screen, and the cold truth hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The registration number did not belong to an elite law firm in Geneva. It did not belong to a wealthy European trust fund at all. It belonged to a domestic limited liability shell company registered just 3 short weeks prior. I traced the banking routing details and the physical corporate address tied directly to the LLC. The satellite map on my screen zoomed in not on a sleek modern skyscraper in the heart of Switzerland, but on a desolate, forgotten industrial plot of land. It was an abandoned, rusted-out warehouse sitting in the middle of a dusty dirt lot in rural Nevada. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the satellite image of the crumbling roof and the overgrown weeds on my monitor. Why would a 29-year-old European billionaire heiress hide her vast family fortune in a deserted American junkyard? The answer was chillingly simple. There was no fortune. There was no family trust. Everything my son believed about his future wife was a meticulously crafted lie. And as I stared at that glowing computer screen, my gut told me that this fake warehouse was just the very tip of a deeply sinister iceberg. I did not wait for morning. I grabbed my keys, walked out into the cool evening air, and drove straight toward downtown Chicago. The drive took exactly 45 minutes, but my mind raced the entire way. I kept picturing that rusted-out warehouse in Nevada. I kept seeing Valerie's innocent smile flashing in my memory. It simply did not add up. A sophisticated woman who wore custom-tailored silk dresses and spoke constantly of summering in the French Riviera did not hide her massive generational wealth in an abandoned desert junkyard. I pulled up to the luxury high-rise where my son lived. I had purchased that sprawling glass penthouse for Jason as a graduation gift when he earned his master's degree. It was supposed to be a solid foundation for his future, a secure place for him to build a family. Now, standing in the cold marble elevator as it shot up to the top floor, I felt like a stranger invading enemy territory. The elevator doors slid open directly into their extravagant foyer. I stepped inside quietly and found them in the massive open-concept kitchen. The walls of glass overlooked the glittering city skyline. Jason was sitting at the white marble island typing away on his expensive laptop, while Valerie stood at the stainless stove. She was wearing a flowing cashmere robe, humming a soft, pleasant tune as she steeped something fragrant in a delicate porcelain teapot. They looked like the perfect picture of domestic bliss. When Jason looked up and saw me standing there, he smiled warmly, clearly, surprised by my evening visit. He asked what I was doing there so late, assuming I had simply forgotten to sign a page of the prenuptial agreement. I walked over to the marble counter and placed the heavy leather folder down with a thud. I did not raise my voice at all. I spoke with the calm, carefully measured tone of a man who simply wanted a logical answer. I told him I had reviewed the document, but I noticed a small discrepancy with the registration of Vanguard Heritage Holdings. I explained that I ran a quick background check, a completely standard procedure I had done thousands of times in my real estate career, and I discovered that the firm did not actually exist in Geneva. I laid the printed photograph of the Nevada warehouse right on top of the prenuptial agreement. I directly asked them why a massive European trust fund was registered to a derelict, crumbling building in the middle of a barren American desert. The silence that instantly followed my question was thick and suffocatingly heavy. Jason stared down at the printed paper, his brow furrowing in deep, genuine confusion. He slowly looked at Valerie, waiting for her to react. I watched her closely, waiting for the panic to set in, waiting for the polite mask to finally slip. But it did not slip. Not even for a fraction of a brief second. Valerie simply looked at me and smiled. It was a gentle, almost pitying smile. She calmly finished pouring the hot water into a delicate teacup, added a fresh sprig of green mint, and walked gracefully around the kitchen island. She placed the steaming cup of artisanal tea right in front of me on the counter. She placed a soft, manicured hand on my arm and let out a light musical laugh that echoed beautifully through the open penthouse. She told me I was incredibly sweet for worrying about them. She explained with perfect fluid confidence that the Nevada address was entirely intentional. She said her family's primary holding company was indeed based securely in Europe, but to aggressively avoid the harsh international tariffs and complex foreign investment taxes when transferring liquid assets into the United States, their elite financial advisors strictly utilized domestic shell companies. Nevada, she pointed out flawlessly, consistently offered some of the absolute strictest corporate privacy laws in the country. She claimed the dilapidated warehouse was just a legal dummy address currently used by hundreds of wealthy foreign investors to maintain total legal anonymity. It was a completely standard high-level corporate tax strategy. Her smooth explanation was incredibly convincing. It sounded heavily researched, dripping with complicated financial jargon that perfectly justified the discrepancy I had found. It was the exact kind of plausible lie, specifically designed to make the person asking the serious question feel completely foolish for even bringing it up in the first place. Jason immediately latched onto her perfect explanation. His initial confusion instantly transformed into aggressive relief, and then swiftly into deep resentment toward me. He aggressively stood up from his bar stool, his face flushing with anger. He slammed his hand down on the marble counter, causing my porcelain teacup to rattle. He angrily accused me of treating his brilliant future wife like an untrustworthy criminal. He raised his voice, shouting that I was a paranoid, controlling old man who could not handle the fact that my son was moving up in the world. He forcefully said I was unfairly projecting my own ruthless, cutthroat business tactics onto a wonderful woman who had shown me absolutely nothing but kindness and respect. He furiously told me that my outdated old blue-collar mentality was embarrassing him, and that I needed to stop treating high society wealth management like a cheap construction site scam. Every single harsh word he spoke cut me deeply, but I did not argue back. I realized in that exact moment that Valerie had completely weaponized my son's insecurities. She knew he desperately craved validation, and she provided it, effectively isolating him from the person who could actually protect him. If I forcefully pushed any harder, Jason would banish me from his life entirely. So I deliberately did the only thing a strategic man could do when outmatched and facing a superior tactical position. I retreated. I lowered my head, staring at the hardwood floor, and played the pathetic role of the foolish, overprotective father. I apologized profusely. I told Jason he was right, that I was just an old man stuck in my old ways, anxious about his financial future. I told Valerie I was deeply sorry for questioning her prominent family's integrity and begged for her immediate forgiveness. Valerie's dark eyes shone with triumphant satisfaction. She accepted my sincere apology with a gracious nod, playing the victim flawlessly. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me in a forgiving embrace. She softly whispered in my ear that we were family now, and family always forgave each other. I returned the tight hug, my heart turning to solid ice. But as I pulled back to leave the kitchen, my sharp gaze drifted past her shoulder. Resting face up on the kitchen counter, next to the teapot, was her secret secondary mobile phone. The screen suddenly lit up with an incoming text message. The phone was completely silent, but in the dim lighting of the kitchen, the bold black letters on the bright screen were impossible for me to miss. The suspicious message was sent from an unsaved number. It read exactly like this: "Asset pacified. Proceed to phase 2. I stepped out of the penthouse elevator and walked toward my car, my mind buzzing with the sinister implications of those words. Asset pacified. Proceed to phase 2. I was the asset. My apology, my submission, my willingness to play the role of the defeated old man had pacified the situation. They thought I was handled. They thought I was no longer a threat to whatever operation Valerie was running. I drove back to my empty house in the suburbs, the silence of the night, offering absolutely no comfort. The streetlights flashed across my windshield like a harsh interrogation. I poured myself a glass of water, gripping the cold counter, as I tried to piece the puzzle together very carefully. If Valerie was not a European heiress, and her trust was a domestic shell company, then what was her actual financial situation? More importantly, what was she doing with the vast amounts of money I was currently pouring into this wedding? I walked into my study and opened the heavy brass safe where I kept my personal financial records. I pulled out the wedding expense file. It was thick, filled with invoices and wire transfer receipts I had personally authorized to ensure Jason had the flawless day he dreamed of. I flipped through the pages until I found the most significant expense. 2 months ago, I had wired $250,000 directly to the Crystal Pavilion venue. That venue was the most exclusive and highly coveted event space in the entire city. The package Valerie had enthusiastically selected included premium imported floral arrangements, a gourmet 5-course menu prepared by a celebrity chef, and an entire symphony orchestra to play throughout the evening. It was an exorbitant amount of money, but I paid it without a single complaint because I wanted my son to be happy. I stared at the official receipt, the bank stamp confirming the transfer of $250,000. My gut tightened fiercely. The sharp instinct that had kept me alive in the ruthless world of commercial real estate was screaming at me now with an overwhelming sense of urgent danger. A woman who fakes a wealthy background and registers a fake foreign trust does not simply spend $250,000 on flowers and caviar. She extracts it. I needed to know exactly what was happening with my money. I barely slept that night. As soon as the sun rose, I put on a tailored suit, the kind I used to wear when closing hostile acquisitions, and drove straight to the Crystal Pavilion. The venue was breathtaking, sitting right on the edge of the water, with massive glass walls that caught the morning light. I walked through the grand double doors and bypassed the front desk, entirely heading straight for the executive management office down the long hall. I knocked once and let myself in. The venue manager, a meticulously dressed man named Gregory, looked up from his desk in surprise. He recognized me immediately. When you write a check for $250,000, people tend to remember your face. I sat down in the plush chair across from him, resting my hands on my cane, projecting an aura of absolute calm control. I told Gregory I was there to do a final review of the floral arrangements and the catering menu for the Kensington wedding scheduled for next month. Gregory frowned, his expression turning into a strange mixture of professional confusion and deep awkwardness. He nervously adjusted his tie and cleared his throat loudly. He asked me if I was aware of the recent changes to the event profile. I kept my face entirely blank, revealing absolutely nothing, and simply asked him to clarify what changes he meant. Gregory pulled up a file on his computer monitor, avoiding my direct gaze. He softly explained that the bride Valerie had come into the office just last week. She told them the family had decided to drastically scale back the event to a more intimate, minimalist aesthetic. She formally downgraded the luxury package. The celebrity chef was canceled and replaced with their basic buffet service. The imported floral arches were swapped for synthetic centerpieces. The symphony orchestra was downgraded to a cheap standard local disc jockey. The new total for the entire wedding package was exactly $50,000. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the information while keeping my breathing steady. $50,000. That meant my original payment was over by $200,000. I asked Gregory in a perfectly level voice what happened to the remaining balance. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting in his heavy leather chair. He explained that following strict instructions from Valerie, they had processed a full refund for the remaining $200,000. My mind raced, calculating the sheer audacity of her scheme. She had created a fake luxury wedding just to secure a massive cash deposit only, to secretly cancel the amenities and pocket the remaining funds. I maintained my composure, hiding the burning rage building inside my chest. I calmly asked Greg to show me the exact routing destination for that massive refund. Gregory hesitated, reminding me that Valerie was the primary contact on the account. However, he also knew I was the original financier who actually provided the funds. After a tense moment of silence, he turned his computer monitor around to face me. I braced myself, fully expecting to see a personal bank account belonging to Valerie, or a sketchy offshore transfer connected to her fake Nevada shell company. But when I read the name of the receiving institution on the official wire confirmation, the blood completely drained from my face in utter shock. The money did not go back to Jason. It did not go to Valerie. It was wired directly to a private, high-security medical facility located in a neighboring state. A facility known exclusively for housing patients with severe mental instability. I stared at the screen, my eyes tracing the name of the institution over and over again. Why would my future daughter-in-law funnel $200,000 of my money into a locked psychiatric ward? The answer hovered at the edge of my consciousness, dark and terrifying. She was not just stealing my money. She was funding something far more sinister. I stood up slowly, thanking Gregory for his time, and walked out of the venue silently. The crisp morning air felt suffocating as I reached my car. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My son was blinded by an illusion, preparing to marry a woman who was systematically draining our assets while preparing a medical trap. I knew I could not confront Jason with this. He was already manipulated into believing I was the enemy. If I showed him the venue receipt, Valerie would invent another flawless lie. She would say the medical facility was for a sick relative, and Jason would believe her. I had to investigate this facility myself. I had to discover exactly who that money was paying for before it was too late. I knew brute force and accusations would only tighten the snare Valerie had carefully laid out for my son. To survive this invisible war, I had to become exactly what she expected me to be. I had to become a tired, docile, fading old man who had finally surrendered his authority. I drove back to my quiet house and spent the afternoon carefully constructing my brand new persona. I practiced walking with a slightly heavier step. I let my shoulders slump forward, giving the distinct impression of a man weighed down by physical exhaustion and emotional defeat. When Jason called me that evening, his tone still sharp and defensive from our previous argument, I did not fight back. I kept my voice incredibly weak, allowing a slight tremor to bleed into my spoken words. I apologized profusely for my earlier behavior regarding the prenuptial agreement. I told him the overwhelming stress of the upcoming wedding and my advancing age were simply making me overly anxious and terribly confused. I assured him that from now on, I would step back and let Valerie handle the remaining arrangements without further interference on my part. Jason sounded immensely relieved, the tension draining from his voice. I could hear Valerie in the background, her tone dripping with artificial sweetness as she told him to tell me not to worry about a single thing. She believed she had broken my spirit entirely. She believed I was blindly marching into whatever slaughterhouse she had meticulously prepared. Behind my weary apologies and submissive posture, my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. The moment I hung up the phone, the fragile old man vanished. I walked down the wooden stairs to my reinforced basement, bypassed my standard wireless network, and booted up a heavily encrypted laptop I kept for sensitive corporate emergencies. I needed a highly specialized ally. I needed someone who possessed the specific technical skills to follow a digital money trail through the darkest corners of the financial system. I picked up my secure mobile phone and dialed a number I had not called in nearly 5 years. The man who answered the phone on the second ring was Victor. Victor was a 60-year-old retired forensic accountant who had spent his entire career untangling complex corporate fraud and international money laundering schemes for the federal government before entering the private sector. We had worked together extensively back when I was aggressively expanding my commercial real estate empire across the Midwest and needed to ensure my corporate acquisitions were absolutely clean. Victor was brilliantly methodical, notoriously discreet, and fiercely loyal to the few people he considered friends. I quickly and calmly explained the entire situation from the very beginning. I told him about the fake Nevada shell company masking as a European family trust, the secretly downgraded wedding venue contract, and the remaining $200,000 wire transfer that had been quietly redirected from the event planners to a private medical facility. Victor listened in absolute analytical silence. He did not interrupt me once. When I finally finished detailing the timeline, he did not offer any empty sympathies. He simply asked me for the exact banking routing numbers and the precise timestamp of the venue transaction. He told me to give him exactly 24 hours to tear the financial firewalls apart and expose the rotting foundation underneath. I spent the entire next day playing my pathetic part flawlessly. I visited Jason at the main corporate office downtown, bringing them lunch and acting entirely blind to the massive storm gathering just out of sight. I smiled politely at Valerie as she reviewed fabric swatches for the reception chairs. I nodded along enthusiastically to her fabricated stories about her wealthy European relatives attending the upcoming ceremony. I played the role of the proud, easily manipulated father to absolute perfection. Every time she looked at me with that triumphant gleam in her dark eyes, I simply smiled back with warmth, knowing that Victor was currently tearing her pristine digital footprint to shreds in the background. Late that Thursday night, while I was sitting alone in my dark study, staring at old family photographs, my secure phone finally rang. It was Victor, and his normally calm voice carried a tight edge of genuine tension. He told me he had successfully bypassed the routing encryption protocols and tracked the exact destination of the missing $200,000. He told me the massive sum of money did not just go to a generic medical clinic or hospital billing department. It was deposited directly into the private holding accounts of a restricted place called Oakwood Serenity Retreat. The name initially sounded pleasant, like a high-end wellness spa or a luxury physical rehabilitation center. But Victor quickly shattered that peaceful illusion. He explained that Oakwood Serenity Retreat was a highly specialized private lockdown psychiatric facility located just across the state line in the remote woods of Wisconsin. It was an intimidating place designed exclusively for patients deemed a severe, permanent danger to themselves or others. It was a bleak institution built heavily on chemical sedation, extremely restricted visitation rights, and permanent physical isolation. My breath hitched in my throat as I processed the terrifying reality. Why would a bride steal $250,000 of my money to secretly fund a locked-down psychiatric ward in a neighboring state? I tightly gripped the polished edge of my mahogany desk and asked Victor if there was any possible way to find out what specific medical services were purchased with that massive sum. He told me standard accounting records would never show patient details due to strict federal privacy laws. However, Victor was not a standard accountant. He had spent the last 3 grueling hours quietly penetrating the internal administrative intake servers of the Oakwood facility itself. He strongly warned me to mentally brace myself before he read the final report he had uncovered. He stated clearly that the $200,000 was not a simple medical bill. It was a massive, non-refundable advance payment required to permanently secure a premium, maximum security solitary confinement suite. This specific suite was designed to hold an unstable patient for the remainder of their natural life, with strict stipulations, explicitly barring outside communication, denying family visits, and allowing heavy medicinal restraint. My heart pounded hard. My throat constricted and my mouth went completely dry in an instant. I asked him in a flat, quiet voice who the suite was legally registered to. I commanded him to read the name of the incoming patient listed on the confidential admission forms. Victor paused for a long, agonizing moment. I could hear the heavy silence on the line before he finally spoke. He told me the intake documents were completely finalized and legally bonded, set to be activated by a medical transport team the morning after the wedding ceremony. He took a deep breath and read the name on the file. The patient, permanently registered for the solitary confinement suite, slated for immediate transfer, was William Kensington. The sound of my own name echoed in my ears like a death sentence. William Kensington. My own son was marrying a woman who secretly paid a fortune to lock me inside a maximum security psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life. I did not drop the phone. I did not scream. I lowered myself into my heavy leather armchair and stared into the dark corners of my basement. The sheer maliciousness of her plan was breathtaking. Valerie was not just trying to steal my real estate empire. She was planning to completely erase me from society. If I went to the police right then, Jason would blindly defend her. He would testify that my wild accusations were proof of the mental decline Valerie was framing me for. I had to remain entirely calm. I thanked Victor for his brilliant work and told him to stand by for my next set of instructions. I needed to look these people in the eyes. I needed to see the faces of the monsters who raised a woman capable of such profound evil. The next morning, Jason called to announce that Valerie's prominent European parents had flown into Chicago for the wedding preparations. He proudly asked if I would host a private dinner at my estate to formally welcome the 2 billionaire families merging together. I forced my voice to sound deeply honored and overwhelmingly excited. I told him I would hire a private executive chef and serve my finest vintage wines to properly welcome our esteemed international guests. In reality, I was setting a very specific stage. When you invite scammers into a house built by genuine hard work, the cracks in their polished facade always begin to show. I spent the afternoon preparing my dining room, ensuring the lighting was incredibly bright and every single detail was flawlessly arranged. I wanted them to feel intimidated. I wanted them to feel the heavy weight of real generational wealth pressing down on their shoulders. Promptly, at 7 o'clock that evening, a pristine black Bentley slowly pulled up my winding driveway. I stood on my front porch, leaning heavily on my wooden cane, playing the role of the frail and welcoming patriarch. Jason stepped out of the luxury vehicle, first beaming with absolute pride. He opened the passenger doors, and Valerie emerged, followed closely by an older couple dressed in what appeared to be expensive tailored clothing. The man introduced to me as Henrik wore a sharp tuxedo that fit just a fraction too tightly across his broad shoulders. The woman introduced as Juliana wore a sweeping silk evening gown and displayed a massive diamond necklace that caught the porch lights perfectly. They greeted me with exaggerated European cheek kisses and forced accents that sounded strangely inconsistent. I smiled warmly, welcoming them into my grand foyer, but my sharp eyes immediately went to work, analyzing every microscopic detail of their presentation. We moved into the dining room, taking our seats around the long mahogany table. The private chef served courses of roasted duck and imported caviar, while Jason eagerly steered the conversation toward his future success. Henrik spoke loudly and confidently about his supposed vast shipping ports in Amsterdam and his extensive private vineyards located in the south of France. Valerie watched him with a perfectly serene smile, periodically touching Jason's arm to keep his attention entirely focused on her. I played the attentive host, asking polite and innocent questions about their luxurious overseas lifestyle. After the third course was cleared, I decided it was the perfect moment to test the structural integrity of their elaborate fabrication. I poured Henrik another glass of expensive red wine and leaned forward with a look of friendly curiosity. I mentioned that I used to spend a significant amount of time conducting real estate business overseas. I told Henrik that during my travels to Monaco, I frequently enjoyed dining at the prestigious Laurentian Royal Yacht Club. I asked him if he happened to keep any of his family vessels docked at that specific marina, adding that the club commodore was a close personal friend of mine. It was a completely fabricated trap. There is absolutely no such place as the Laurentian Royal Yacht Club in Monaco. I simply invented the elegant-sounding name right there on the spot. Henrik did not even pause to think. He eagerly took a large sip of his wine and smiled broadly. He loudly agreed, boasting that he was actually a platinum founding member of that exact yacht club. He confidently claimed that his favorite summer yacht was permanently docked there, and that we would absolutely have to share a drink on the terrace the next time I visited Europe. I smiled warmly and nodded my head, complimenting his excellent taste. Beside him, Valerie briefly stiffened her eyes, darting sharply toward her fake father, but she quickly masked her reaction by taking a sip of her water. The trap had snapped shut flawlessly. My attention then shifted smoothly to Juliana, who was aggressively complaining about the terrible jet lag from their private flight. As she reached across the table to grab a warm dinner roll, the wide sleeve of her silk gown slid back, exposing her wrist. She was wearing what appeared to be a solid gold luxury watch. Jason had previously bragged to me that it was a priceless vintage family heirloom passed down through generations. But the bright dining room lights illuminated something entirely different. Where the heavy metal band pressed tightly against her skin, there was a distinct dark green ring of tarnish staining her wrist. Genuine solid gold does not react with human sweat to leave cheap green oxidation marks. Only heavily plated brass or cheap copper alloys produce that specific chemical reaction. I stared at the green stain for a fraction of a second, before politely asking her if she was enjoying her meal. She smiled brightly, completely unaware that her cheap costume jewelry had just exposed her as an absolute fraud. The dinner concluded after 2 hours of listening to their fabricated wealth. I walked them out to the grand driveway, thanking them profusely. Jason hugged me tightly, whispering how happy he was that our families were getting along. I patted his back, feeling a suffocating sorrow for how brutally his world was about to collapse. I stood on the porch and watched the heavy taillights of the Bentley disappear down the dark road. The moment they were out of sight, I walked straight back down into my secure basement. The phone was vibrating on my desk. I picked it up and heard Victor breathing on the other end. He told me he had just finished running the registration plates for the black Bentley they arrived in. I stood perfectly still in the dim light, asking him exactly who the luxury vehicle was registered to. Victor did not hesitate. He told me the vehicle did not belong to any wealthy European trust. The luxury car was rented earlier that exact same afternoon by a local theatrical casting agency located in the poorest district of downtown Chicago. The billionaire parents were nothing but cheap local actors. I stood in the dim light of my basement, holding the secure phone to my ear, as Victor repeated the information. The sleek black Bentley that had just rolled down my driveway was a rental. The elegant tuxedo Henrik wore was a costume. Juliana and her fake European accent were hired for the evening from a struggling casting agency located on the rougher south side of Chicago. A wave of profound clarity washed over me. Valerie had staged an elaborate theatrical production right inside my own dining room, just to satisfy my request to meet her family. I printed the digital rental agreements and agency invoices Victor securely forwarded to my email. Holding the warm papers in my hands, I felt a sudden surge of tragic relief. I believed this was the end of the nightmare. I thought holding proof of Valerie using actors would finally shatter the illusion blinding my son. I thought Jason would look at the agency receipts, realize he was engaged to a fraud, and immediately cancel the wedding. I severely underestimated the depth of Valerie's psychological manipulation. The following morning, I drove to the corporate headquarters of Kensington Properties. I bypassed the receptionist and walked straight into Jason's corner office. He sat behind the massive glass desk I gave him, looking over blueprints for a new commercial development. When he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, he smiled brightly, thanking me again for hosting such a wonderful dinner the night before. He said Valerie was thrilled our families were blending so seamlessly. I did not smile back. I walked over to his desk, took a deep breath, and placed the printed rental agreements and casting agency invoices directly on top of his blueprints. I spoke with a gentle, compassionate voice, preparing to catch my son as his world collapsed. I told him I loved him deeply, but I needed him to look very closely at those papers. I explained that Henrik and Juliana were not billionaire European aristocrats. I told him they were paid performers hired to deceive us. I braced myself for his shock. I waited for the confusion, the heartbreak, the inevitable realization that the woman he loved was a pathological liar. Instead, Jason stared at the papers for a brief moment, and his face twisted into an expression of absolute unadulterated rage. He did not look betrayed by Valerie. He looked violently betrayed by me. He stood up so fast his heavy leather chair slammed into the glass wall behind him. He did not ask me how I found the documents. He did not ask me why Valerie would do such a thing. He slammed his fists down on the desk and leaned forward, his eyes burning with an intense, furious fire. He asked me how I could possibly be so cruel, so invasive, and so toxic. I stood there in complete bewilderment as my own son defended the woman who was currently scamming him. Jason shouted that he already knew about the actors. He furiously explained that Valerie had come to him weeping hysterically 3 days ago, shattered by shame and guilt. She preemptively confessed to him that her real parents were not wealthy European aristocrats. According to the tragic story she spun, her real parents were abusive drug addicts who lived in a squalid trailer park. She told Jason she was absolutely terrified that if I found out she came from such a broken, poverty-stricken background, my elitist standards would force him to leave her. She claimed she hired the actors in a desperate, panic-driven attempt to protect the Kensington family name from public scandal and to spare me the embarrassment of associating with her real family. Jason pointed an angry finger directly at my chest. He yelled that Valerie was a victim of a horrible childhood who had worked incredibly hard to reinvent herself, and instead of showing her basic human compassion, I had hired private investigators to dig through her deepest trauma. He accused me of trying to sabotage his happiness simply because I could not accept that he had found a woman who loved him for who he was rather than for the corporate empire he managed. The psychological trap Valerie had built was a masterpiece of emotional gaslighting. She perfectly anticipated my investigation. She knew I would uncover the actors, so she fed Jason a preemptive sob story that immunized him against the truth. By framing her deception as an act of desperate love and framing me as the ruthless, suspicious villain, she had neutralized the hardest evidence I possessed. I tried to speak, to beg him, to listen to basic reason. I tried to tell him about the fake offshore trust in Nevada and the canceled wedding venue, but he refused to hear another single word. He raised his hand, silencing me with a look of pure contempt. He coldly stated that my paranoid investigations were destroying his mental health and threatening his future marriage. He told me that he could no longer trust my judgment, and that my presence in his life was becoming a liability to his personal peace. Jason walked over to his secure office terminal. He typed in a long command sequence, his jaw set in a rigid, unforgiving line. He did not look at me as he spoke his next words. He declared that in order to protect Valerie and his future family from my relentless, toxic interference, he was officially exercising his legal authority as the current chief executive officer of Kensington Properties. I watched in quiet horror as he brought up the master administrative dashboard for our entire corporate financial network. The network I had built from nothing. The servers that held the lifeblood of our real estate empire. He told me that effective immediately, he was revoking my executive clearance. He said he could not allow a man who would hire investigators to stalk a traumatized young woman to have unrestricted access to the company assets. He pressed the enter key with a loud, final clack. A bright red error message flashed across the master screen, confirming the security protocol override. My personal administrative access codes were deleted from the system. I stood frozen in the exact center of the office I had personally designed. The absolute gravity of what Jason had just done washed over me like freezing water. He had not just defended his fraudulent bride. He had actively disarmed his own father. Without my master executive security clearance, I was now completely locked out of the primary financial servers. I could no longer see any of the daily transaction logs. I could no longer monitor the outgoing wire transfers. I could no longer track where the millions of dollars in our corporate accounts were flowing. By effortlessly manipulating my son's desperate desire to play the hero for a damsel in distress, Valerie had successfully removed the only remaining obstacle standing between her and my entire fortune. I was now entirely blind to the cash flow of my own empire, and the real bleeding was just about to begin in earnest. But a man who spent half a century surviving the ruthless world of Chicago real estate never builds a fortress without hiding a back door. I did not argue with Jason. I simply nodded, turned on my heel, and walked out of the corporate headquarters. I drove straight to a secluded industrial park on the outskirts of the city. Tucked away at the very end of a forgotten dead-end street was an old dusty garage I had owned since the late 1990s. It was the original storage unit for my very first construction equipment, a place Jason had not visited since he was a small boy. I unlocked the heavy metal door, letting the smell of old motor oil and damp concrete fill my lungs. I walked past the rusting scaffolding and pulled a heavy canvas tarp off a large metal desk in the back corner. Sitting perfectly preserved underneath was an archaic, blocky computer terminal connected to an enormous analog server rack back in 1998, when we first transitioned the company ledgers to a digital network. I fundamentally distrusted the idea of putting my entire life work onto a fragile, invisible cloud. I hired an independent engineer to hardwire this physical analog server directly into the architectural mainframe of the company. It operated completely independent of the modern administrative dashboard. Jason did not even know this machine existed. It took almost 10 minutes for the old hardware to fully boot up. The heavy cooling fans roared to life and the bulky monitor slowly flickered, illuminating the dark garage with a harsh green glow. I typed in a complex string of original override commands I had memorized over 2 decades ago. Because this analog terminal served as the foundational root access for the entire corporate network, it bypassed the modern security lockout effortlessly. The ancient screen flickered one final time before bringing up the master financial ledgers for Kensington Properties. I leaned forward in my folding chair, the green text reflecting in my eyes, and began to carefully track the active cash flow. What I found hidden within the digital pages of our corporate accounts was horrifying enough to make my blood run entirely cold. Valerie was not simply draining my personal checking account to fund her fake wedding. That $250,000 venue deposit was merely a distraction. a shiny object designed to keep my attention focused on petty event planning while she executed the real heist in the shadows. I watched the green numbers scroll across the screen, revealing a series of massive, highly irregular corporate transactions that had been initiated over the past 3 weeks. Jason was aggressively liquidating the liquid assets of our most profitable commercial properties. I was leveraging the bedrock of the company, taking out massive corporate loans against our prime real estate and funneling the capital directly into a series of exorbitant, incredibly suspicious purchases. I traced the destination of these massive wire transfers. They were all being sent to Vanguard Heritage Holdings, the fake Swiss trust registered to the abandoned dirt lot in Nevada. I opened the corresponding purchase orders to see exactly what my son was buying with millions of dollars of company money. My heart hammered against my ribs. Jason was purchasing absolute garbage. He was using our corporate treasury to buy worthless, non-existent commercial real estate development patents and phantom European architectural technology rights. Valerie had convinced him that her wealthy family was giving him exclusive early access to revolutionary European building technologies that would double the value of our company. In reality, she was tricking him into emptying our corporate vaults into her personal shell company in exchange for completely worthless pieces of paper. The first transaction was for $400,000. The second was for $800,000. The most recent wire processed just that morning was for a staggering $1.2 million. The company was bleeding millions of dollars by the hour. The sheer scale of the financial hemorrhage was catastrophic. If this continued for even a few more weeks, the entire real estate empire I had spent 50 years building would be completely bankrupted, hollowed out from the inside by a woman who did not even exist. The meticulous precision of her scam was breathtaking. She had isolated the chief executive, alienated the founder, and gained unrestricted access to the treasury. My immediate instinct was to pick up my secure mobile phone and call the primary banks. I wanted to freeze every single corporate account, void the fraudulent transactions, and lock the remaining assets down immediately. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the device ready to dial the emergency fraud department. But as my thumb hovered over the glowing keypad, a terrifying realization paralyzed my hand completely. I stared at the green glow of the monitor, my eyes locking onto the digital authorization signatures attached to every single one of those fraudulent wire transfers. The signatures did not belong to Valerie. They belonged entirely to Jason. As the active chief executive officer of Kensington Properties, he had legally authorized the purchase of those fake patents. He had legally signed the massive loan documents leveraging our buildings. He had personally approved every single disastrous wire transfer. If I forcefully stopped the bleeding by reporting the massive corporate fraud to the banking authorities, I would instantly trigger a massive federal investigation. The Securities and Exchange Commission would immediately seize the company records. They would not see Valerie, the manipulative mastermind, pulling the strings from the shadows. They would strictly follow the paper trail, and that undeniable paper trail pointed directly at my son. If I blew the whistle right now, the federal government would aggressively arrest Jason for multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement. He would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. He would be stripped of his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom. He would be sentenced to decades in federal prison, his entire life completely and utterly destroyed. I slowly lowered my phone, the terrifying brilliance of Valerie's strategy finally coming into sharp, devastating focus. She had not just stolen my money. She had fundamentally weaponized my son against his own future, positioning him as the perfect legal shield for her crimes. If she went down, Jason would automatically go down with her. She had meticulously built an absolutely perfect, totally inescapable, and flawlessly designed financial trap. I sat alone in the incredibly dark, dusty garage, carefully listening to the hum of the old server, realizing the true magnitude of the war I was fighting. I could not simply call the authorities. I could not brute force my way out of this disaster. To save my empire and my son, I had to find a way to dismantle a ticking time bomb without triggering the explosive. The extravagant wedding was approaching fast, and the millions were still violently bleeding out of my company. I left the dusty garage and drove back through the dark, quiet streets of Chicago, feeling a profound sense of isolation. The heavy burden of my discovery pressed down on my chest like a physical weight. I had spent my entire adult life meticulously building an empire of concrete and steel, navigating economic recessions and brutal municipal politics. I had always found a way to win. Sitting behind the steering wheel of my car that night, I felt entirely paralyzed. My son was holding the matches, completely unaware that he was standing inside a room soaked in gasoline. Valerie had woven a brilliant, indestructible web around him. She knew any direct attack I made on her would inevitably trigger a massive legal avalanche, burying Jason under federal embezzlement charges. I parked in my driveway, turning off the engine, and just sat in the absolute silence for a long time. I was caught in an impossible stalemate, watching my life work burn to the ground, entirely unable to call the fire department. I walked inside my empty house and paced the hardwood floor of my living room. I needed a miracle, a critical mistake on her part, or a hidden piece of leverage that could shatter her control over Jason without alerting the highly aggressive financial authorities to the bleeding corporate accounts. Every single second that ticked by felt like a brutal reminder of my own failure to protect my family. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed loudly, echoing through the desolate house. It was just past 2 in the morning when my secure mobile phone suddenly vibrated on the kitchen counter. The harsh buzzing sound shattered the heavy silence. I picked up the device and saw Victor's encrypted number flashing on the bright screen. I answered the call immediately, knowing that Victor never reached out at this hour unless he had uncovered something monumental. His voice came through the speaker, carrying an unusual sharp edge of raw tension that I had rarely heard in all the decades we had worked together. He did not bother with polite greetings or formal introductions. He aggressively told me to sit down and open my encrypted email inbox immediately. He firmly stated that he had finally managed to crack the impenetrable digital firewall surrounding Valerie's supposedly pristine European background. He warned me that what he had found hidden deep within the discarded municipal archives of a rural Midwestern town was going to completely redefine the entire battlefield we were currently standing on. I swiftly walked into my study, booted up my secure laptop, and accessed the encrypted server. Victor explained that he had abandoned the useless search for overseas wealth and instead utilized specialized facial recognition software, scanning her image against deep domestic databases managed by federal law enforcement agencies across the entire nation. The email loaded onto my glowing screen, displaying a series of scanned, highly confidential legal documents. I stared at the dense paragraphs, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted lines. Victor's voice filled the quiet room as he methodically walked me through the shocking findings. He told me the woman currently sleeping in my son's luxury penthouse was not 29 years old. She was not a sophisticated European technology heiress, and she did not come from an aristocratic family of billionaires. Her actual age was 42. Her real legal name was Veronica. She was born and raised in a heavily impoverished county in the Midwest, and she had spent the last 2 decades moving from state to state, leaving a long, quiet trail of completely ruined men in her wake. She was a professional, highly trained chameleon, a brilliant manipulator who seamlessly adapted her accent, her wardrobe, and her entire personality to perfectly match the specific desires of her wealthy, vulnerable targets. The European accent was entirely fake, practiced, and perfected over years of deceit. The designer clothes were likely purchased with funds stolen from previous victims. The pristine, flawless persona she projected was nothing more than a carefully constructed, masterfully executed illusion designed to blind, lonely, ambitious men exactly like my son, trapping them in a web of sophisticated lies and emotional dependency. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I scrolled through the extensive background report. It was horrifying to realize that a seasoned predator was currently sharing a bed with Jason. But Victor was not finished speaking. He told me that discovering her true age and fabricated identity was only the beginning of the nightmare. He took a deep, audible breath through the phone receiver and delivered the most devastating piece of information yet. He calmly stated that Veronica was not acting alone in this elaborate financial heist. She was part of a highly organized, deeply experienced criminal partnership. He told me to open the second attachment in the secure email. I clicked on the digital file, my fingers trembling slightly against the mouse. A standard domestic marital record appeared on my monitor. According to the certified legal document, Veronica was currently actively and legally married. She had tied the knot 15 years ago, and there was absolutely no record of a divorce or legal separation ever being filed in any state. She was orchestrating a massive multi-million-dollar fake wedding with my son, while remaining fully legally bound to another man. Victor then instructed me to open the final attachment in the digital folder. He warned me that this specific document would explain exactly how they managed to execute such a flawless, high-level corporate infiltration without leaving a single trace of suspicious activity behind. I clicked on the final file. A stark, unflattering law enforcement mugshot filled the center of my computer screen. The photograph featured a man with sharp facial features, calculating eyes, and a completely unremorseful expression. Victor read the criminal history aloud. The man in the photograph was her legal husband. His name was Richard, a convicted, highly skilled confidence artist who had previously served 7 years in a federal penitentiary for orchestrating complex wire fraud and corporate identity theft. He was the mastermind behind the fake Nevada shell company. I was the architect of the sophisticated banking maneuvers slowly draining my empire. I stared at the criminal mugshot, my heart pounding violently against my ribs as a terrifying wave of recognition crashed over me. I did not just know this man from a police database. I knew his face intimately. I had shared dinner with him. I had shaken his hand just 3 days ago. Richard, the convicted federal con artist, was currently living rent-free in the luxurious guest house situated directly behind Jason's sprawling estate. He had been staying there for the past month, given unrestricted access to my son's property. I recognized the sharp eyes and the confident, manipulative smile instantly. He was not hiding in the shadows. He was hiding in plain sight, boldly posing as Valerie's flamboyant, highly demanding, and deeply trusted personal wedding planner, orchestrating my total destruction from within the very walls of my own family. It was a truly perfect disguise. I sat in the silence of my basement, staring at the criminal mugshot, illuminating my computer monitor. The man orchestrating the destruction of my real estate empire was sleeping just a few miles away, comfortably installed in the lavish guest house of my own son. Valerie and Rick were apex predators, executing a highly coordinated financial siege right under our noses. I knew I could not simply call the police. The moment a uniform showed up at the estate, Valerie would trigger her fail-safes, and Jason would take the fall for the corporate embezzlement. I needed to look the devil directly in the eyes. I needed to walk right into the belly of the beast, observe their dynamic, and gather biological evidence. The following morning, I dressed in a knitted sweater projecting the image of a defeated retiree. I drove my sedan to Jason's suburban estate, unannounced. I parked in the driveway before ringing the doorbell. Valerie opened the heavy oak door. She was wearing a flowing white dress, looking effortlessly beautiful and surprised by my sudden arrival. She quickly masked her initial shock with a bright smile, ushering me into the grand foyer. I told her I was in the neighborhood and wanted to apologize again for my previous behavior. I played the role of the lonely father, claiming the stress of the wedding preparations was making me feel terribly isolated. Valerie immediately shifted into her flawless performance of the compassionate daughter-in-law. She gently took my arm and guided me into the massive sunlit living room. Sitting on the plush sofa, reviewing a stack of elegant floral arrangements, was the man from the mugshot. Rick looked completely different in person. He wore a brightly colored silk shirt, projecting the flamboyant persona of an exclusive celebrity wedding planner. Valerie introduced him to me with a beaming smile. She called him her absolute savior, the genius coordinating every detail of the upcoming ceremony. Rick stood up and shook my hand. His grip was firm, but his calculating eyes scanned me up and down, assessing the threat level of the old man standing before him. I smiled back warmly, thanking him for taking wonderful care of my family. Valerie insisted that I sit down and rest. She told me I looked pale and exhausted. She claimed she had just received a rare, expensive blend of herbal tea from her relatives in Europe. She promised it possessed incredible calming properties designed to relax the nervous system. She practically demanded that I let her brew a fresh pot just for me. I nodded graciously, sinking heavily into an armchair. As she walked gracefully into the kitchen, leaving me alone with her criminal husband, my mind flashed back to the ominous text message I had seen glowing on her burner phone just a few days prior. Asset pacified. Proceed to phase 2. I knew with absolute chilling certainty that whatever she was brewing in that kitchen was not meant to soothe my nerves. It was meant to permanently silence them. I engaged in light conversation about the wedding decor, carefully studying his mannerisms. He played his part brilliantly, using theatrical hand gestures and dramatic sighs, completely masking the hardened federal convict hiding underneath. 10 minutes later, Valerie returned carrying a silver tray. She placed a steaming porcelain teacup in front of me on the glass coffee table. The liquid inside was a dark, murky amber, giving off an overpowering scent of bitter chamomile and crushed lavender. She hovered over me, her dark eyes fixed on my face. She urged me to drink it while it was still piping hot, claiming the therapeutic benefits were strongest right after brewing. I picked up the cup, feeling the heat radiating through the thin porcelain. Both Valerie and Rick stood there in absolute silence and watched me with a subtle, deeply predatory anticipation that made my stomach turn over. I raised the cup to my lips. Just as the rim touched my mouth, I deliberately faked a sudden, violent coughing fit. I hunched over, pressing my free hand against my chest, hacking loudly as if struggling for air. Valerie instinctively stepped back in surprise, her facade cracking for a fraction of a second. Rick quickly turned his head, startled by the harsh noise. In that brief, crucial window of distraction, I swiftly reached into my sweater pocket and pulled out a small glass vial I had brought. I poured a small amount of the dark liquid into the vial, capping it and slipping it back into my pocket. Then, with a smooth, fluid motion hidden by my coughing, I tipped the rest of the poisoned tea directly into the soil of a beautiful white potted orchid sitting on the decorative side table right next to my armchair. I gasped heavily for breath, apologizing profusely to both of them for my sudden dramatic coughing spell. I carefully placed the empty porcelain teacup back onto the gleaming silver tray. I told them the tea was incredibly soothing, but my sudden persistent cough meant I probably needed to go back home and rest my weary lungs for the remainder of the long day. Valerie looked straight down at the empty cup, a terrifying flash of profound satisfaction taking over her beautiful features. She genuinely believed I had blindly swallowed every single drop of her toxic concoction. She gently patted my shoulder, her voice dripping with pure, sickening sweetness, telling me to go home, lock my doors, and sleep soundly. She enthusiastically promised they would smoothly handle absolutely everything from here on out. I thanked them both, leaning heavily on my wooden cane as I slowly shuffled out the front door, leaving the two confident predators to happily celebrate their perceived final victory in the sunlit living room. I did not go home to rest. I drove my car straight to a secluded diner on the edge of the city where Victor was waiting for me in a back booth. I slid into the vinyl seat and handed him the small glass vial filled with the liquid. Victor did not ask any questions. He carefully placed the vial into a secure evidence bag, telling me his contact at a toxicology laboratory would run an expedited comprehensive chemical analysis immediately. He promised to call me the very second the forensic results were finalized. I thanked him and drove back to my empty house. By early evening, I was sitting completely alone in the absolute silence of my dark study when my secure phone finally illuminated. It was Victor, and his voice was devoid of any emotion, delivering the horrifying truth. The laboratory tests confirmed my worst fears. The herbal tea was spiked with dangerous chemical sedatives. Victor read the report aloud. The compounds found were a potent cocktail of powerful benzodiazepines and memory-altering tranquilizers. He warned me this combination was routinely used to forcibly induce extreme cognitive impairment, flawlessly mimicking the devastating symptoms of severe dementia. I stared at the glowing screen of my secure mobile phone. The furious text message from Jason glared back at me, filled with bitter resentment. He aggressively complained that my clumsy behavior had ruined what was supposed to be a peaceful afternoon for his stressed bride. He then added a strange detail at the end of his angry message. He stated that the expensive white-potted orchid sitting next to my armchair had mysteriously withered and died in a matter of hours. The leaves had turned entirely black, and the delicate white petals had crumpled into a decaying heap. I slowly lowered the phone, feeling a chilling wave of pure dread wash over my body. The heavy sedatives mixed into that porcelain teacup were so incredibly toxic that they had violently killed a healthy plant in less than half a day. If I had blindly swallowed that dark amber liquid, my cognitive functions would have been completely obliterated by nightfall. Valerie was not simply trying to keep me quiet. She was trying to erase my mind. I knew surviving her poisoned tea was only a temporary victory. I was navigating a deadly minefield in absolute darkness. I needed to see their exact blueprint. I needed to know the precise timeline of their operation and exactly how they planned to execute my legal demise without raising red flags with the authorities. I immediately called Victor back. I told him we could no longer afford to operate from a distance. We needed to forcefully penetrate the digital network of the guest house where the convicted con artist was residing. I instructed Victor to pack his mobile surveillance equipment and meet me on the desolate service road running directly behind Jason's sprawling suburban estate. The night air was freezing as I pulled my unmarked sedan onto the gravel shoulder. Victor arrived 10 minutes later in a dark van. I climbed into the back of his vehicle, where he had already established a highly sophisticated digital command center. The cramped space was illuminated by the harsh blue light of 3 monitors. Victor was typing rapidly, his eyes fixed intensely on the scrolling code. I explained that Jason had recently installed a commercial-grade wireless network for the entire property. However, because Rick was arrogant and lazy, he had bypassed the complex security protocols of the main house to set up a weaker secondary wireless extension router inside the guest house for his own convenience. That single moment of criminal overconfidence was the exact vulnerability Victor needed to slip through the digital backdoor undetected. I sat in silence, watching the master at work. For 30 agonizing minutes, the only sound was the rapid clicking of keys. Finally, Victor let out a low breath. He had successfully breached the network and established a direct connection to the personal laptop sitting on Rick's bedside table. Victor systematically bypassed the standard password protections and began to scour the hard drive for hidden partitions. He ignored the fake wedding planning spreadsheets and drove straight into the encrypted folders buried deep within the system architecture. With a few final keystrokes, a heavily protected directory cracked open, spilling its contents across the monitors. Victor silently opened the primary file. It was an official, perfectly formatted medical dossier. At the top of the crisp digital page was the logo of a highly prestigious neurological clinic located right here in Chicago. Below this prominent logo was my full legal name, my date of birth, and my comprehensive medical history. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. The document was an incredibly detailed psychiatric assessment. It described me as a deeply disturbed individual suffering from a rapid onset, highly aggressive, and completely irreversible form of vascular dementia. The fabricated notes detailed a long history of severe paranoia, violent outbursts, and a total inability to manage my own basic financial affairs. I stared at the terrifying words, feeling a cold sweat break out across my neck. The medical file was not just a generic forgery created on a cheap word processor. It bore the digital signature, the official medical license number, and the certified verification stamp of a prominent, highly respected local neurologist. Valerie and Rick had successfully bribed a legitimate practicing medical professional to legally sign my life away. This doctor had risked his entire career, likely for an exorbitant sum of cash stolen from my own corporate treasury, to officially validate a diagnosis that would permanently strip me of my fundamental human rights. Victor opened the next document in the hidden folder. It was a meticulously detailed operational timeline laying out the exact mechanics of their sinister trap in cold black and white. The schedule was synchronized perfectly with the upcoming wedding ceremony. The timeline explicitly dictated that Valerie would continue to administer the heavy sedatives in small doses leading up to the main event. These doses would steadily accumulate in my bloodstream, causing mild confusion and subtle memory lapses that Jason would easily witness and mistake for natural aging. Then the timeline detailed the final strike. The morning immediately following the lavish wedding reception, the sedatives would reach their overwhelming concentration in my system. The operational blueprint stated that I would experience a catastrophic cognitive collapse. I would appear entirely incoherent, deeply aggressive, and completely divorced from reality. At that precise moment, the bribed neurologist would be urgently called to the estate to perform an emergency evaluation. With my son watching me thrash around in a chemically induced stupor, the corrupt doctor would present the pre-signed medical dossier. He would gravely inform Jason that my violent dementia had reached a critical stage, requiring immediate forceful institutionalization for my own safety. The true horror of their psychological manipulation finally clicked into place. The blueprint spelled out exactly how Jason would react. Exhausted from the wedding and emotionally shattered by the sudden loss of his father's mind, he would be completely incapable of managing the corporate fallout. In that moment of absolute vulnerability, Valerie would step forward as the perfect supportive wife. The timeline concluded with the final objective. As the medical transport team forcefully strapped me to a stretcher and drove me across state lines to be permanently locked inside the solitary confinement wing of the Oakwood Serenity Retreat, Jason would legally surrender. Desperate to focus on his grieving family, he would sign a comprehensive power of attorney agreement, handing full, unquestioned executive control of the entire Kensington real estate empire directly to his new wife. I sat back heavily in the cramped van, staring blankly at the glowing computer screens. The sheer magnitude of their calculated evil left me entirely speechless and sick to my stomach. Valerie was going to use my son's love and deep grief as the ultimate weapon to legally execute me. If I did nothing in a few short weeks, I would surely wake up locked inside a cold, padded room, completely stripped of my mind, my money, and my freedom, while the ruthless criminals reigned over everything I had ever built. The lavish wedding was approaching fast, and the trap was perfectly armed and ready to snap shut forever. I sat in the back of the surveillance van, surrounded by the hum of cooling fans and the harsh glow of the computer monitors. The horrifying reality of the situation settled deep into my bones. Valerie had completely cornered me. My initial instinct was to aggressively tear the entire operation down, to drive straight to the authorities and expose her massive fraud. But the brilliant cruelty of her plan held me entirely paralyzed. I could not simply cancel the wedding or confront her directly. If I triggered any form of legal alarm, Valerie and Rick would immediately vanish into the wind with the millions they had already stolen. They would leave behind a devastating trail of digital evidence that pointed exclusively at my son. Jason had legally authorized every single one of those disastrous wire transfers. He had signed the loan documents leveraging our most valuable commercial buildings. The federal investigators would not care about a fake European heiress or a sob story. They would see a young corporate executive who embezzled millions from his own company. If I fought back using conventional methods, Jason would be sentenced to decades in federal prison. I had to outsmart a pair of professional criminals without letting them know I was even in the game. I looked at Victor and told him to secure every piece of evidence onto an encrypted physical drive. I needed to move the battlefield to a place where Valerie had absolutely no power. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when I returned to my empty house. I did not go to sleep. I walked into my study and opened my private contact book. I needed absolute loyalty. I bypassed the modern corporate executives and dialed the personal home numbers of the 4 oldest members of my board of directors. These were the men who had stood by my side 40 years ago when Kensington Properties was nothing but a single pickup truck and a dream. They were men who had poured concrete in the freezing rain and negotiated brutal union contracts with me. I woke each of them up in the middle of the night. I did not explain the situation over the phone. I kept my voice perfectly calm and strictly commanded them to meet me at the old industrial storage warehouse on the south side of the city within the hour. I told them to tell no one where they were going and to leave their mobile phones inside their vehicles. The sheer urgency in my voice guaranteed their immediate compliance. Then I made one final call to my personal corporate attorney, Jonathan Reed. I told Jonathan to bring his official notary seal and a stack of blank, highly secure trust formation documents. The warehouse was freezing and smelled of old dust and rusted iron. A single industrial light bulb hung from the high ceiling, casting harsh shadows across a large wooden work table I had set up in the center of the room. One by one, my most trusted friends arrived. They wore heavy coats over their pajamas, looking confused and deeply concerned by the intense secrecy of the midnight gathering. Jonathan arrived last, clutching his heavy leather briefcase. Once the heavy metal doors were completely bolted shut, I stood at the head of the table. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I opened the encrypted drive Victor had provided and began laying out the printed documents under the glaring light. I showed them the fake Swiss trust registered to the abandoned dirt lot in Nevada. I showed them the criminal mugshot of the man currently living in Jason's guest house and posing as an extravagant wedding planner. I showed them the secretly downgraded wedding venue contract and the missing $200,000. Finally, I placed the forged medical dossier and the solitary confinement admission papers for the psychiatric ward directly in the center of the table. The initial silence in the freezing warehouse was absolute. These hardened, experienced businessmen stared at the papers in profound horror. When the reality of the situation finally registered, their shock quickly transformed into explosive, protective fury. One of my oldest friends slammed his fist onto the wooden table, demanding we call the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately to have Valerie and Rick arrested before dawn. I raised my hand, commanding them to lower their voices. I carefully laid out the corporate ledger, showing the massive bleeding of our financial assets. I pointed directly to Jason's unmistakable signature, authorizing the purchase of the worthless overseas technology patents. I explained the terrifying leverage Valerie possessed. I told them that if we involved law enforcement right now, the criminals would trigger their fail-safes. The authorities would aggressively prosecute Jason for corporate embezzlement, completely destroying his life. We could not rely on the police to save us from this particular nightmare. We had to execute a flawless, totally silent boardroom coup right here in the shadows. We had to legally dismantle my son's executive authority and completely drain the corporate treasury before Valerie could steal another dime, and we had to do it without alerting anyone. I turned to Jonathan, who was already pulling legal pads from his heavy briefcase. I outlined my emergency strategy. We were going to legally liquidate every single vulnerable commercial property that Jason had not already leveraged. We were going to gather every available cent of capital from the company accounts. Then we were going to sweep the entire financial foundation of Kensington Properties into an irrevocable, untouchable blind trust. I would be the sole architect of this trust, and the assets would be completely shielded from any executive actions. Legal claims or marital property disputes It was a massive, incredibly complex corporate maneuver, but Jonathan moved with brilliant, practiced efficiency. We spent the next 3 hours in the freezing cold drafting the emergency resolutions. My loyal board members signed the binding authorizations unanimously, voting to completely strip Jason of his executive power and sever his legal access to the company treasury. I was legally taking back my empire by forcefully tearing it out of my son's hands. It was a painful, agonizing process, but it was the only way to insulate the company from the devastating financial damage Valerie had orchestrated. By 5 in the morning, the heavy stack of legal documents was completely finalized. Jonathan pressed his official notary seal onto the final page, officially securing the blind trust. The millions of dollars remaining in our corporate accounts were now legally locked away behind an impenetrable financial wall. If Valerie or Rick tried to initiate another fraudulent wire transfer, they would find the accounts completely empty and inaccessible. However, a dangerous problem remained. If Jason walked into his office the next morning and discovered his executive access was revoked, Valerie would instantly know her entire scheme had been compromised. She would panic, abandon the wedding, and execute her dead man switch. I could not let her discover the empty vault early. I told Jonathan to deliberately post-date the trust. It activates wedding morning, with the corporate assets securely locked away behind an impenetrable legal wall. I finally left the freezing warehouse. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Chicago skyline, casting a pale gray light across the empty streets. I drove back to my quiet suburban house and collapsed into my bed for a few brief hours of restless sleep. When I woke up, the heavy reality of what I had to do that evening settled over me like a suffocating blanket. It was Friday, the night of the official rehearsal dinner. This was the final social event before the lavish wedding ceremony, and it was the perfect stage for Valerie to solidify her narrative regarding my rapid mental decline. I met with Victor one last time in the parking lot behind a local grocery store. He handed me a tiny, smooth object no larger than a standard shirt button. It was a military-grade micro-tracking device completely undetectable to standard security scanners. He told me it was fully charged and linked directly to the main surveillance monitor in his van. My strict instructions were to find a way to plant it securely on the convicted con artist before the night was over. I placed the small device carefully into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. I spent the next hour standing in front of my bathroom mirror, physically preparing my body for the deeply humiliating performance I was about to deliver to my son. I arrived at the rehearsal dinner 30 minutes late, deliberately dragging out my entrance. The event was held in the private dining room of a phenomenally expensive downtown steakhouse, undoubtedly paid for using the funds they had maliciously siphoned from my company treasury. As I slowly pushed open the heavy oak doors, the low murmur of conversation instantly ceased. Everyone turned to look at me. I hunched my shoulders forward, letting my posture sag dramatically. I shuffled my feet across the polished hardwood floor, heavily leaning my entire body weight onto my wooden cane. Jason immediately stood up from the head of the long table, his face etched with genuine agonizing concern. He rushed over to my side, gently taking my arm to guide me toward my designated chair. I forced my hands to tremble violently as I walked. Valerie was seated right next to my son, wearing a stunning black evening gown, playing the role of the incredibly supportive future daughter-in-law. Standing just behind her chair was Rick, dressed in a sharp maroon suit, holding a clipboard and pretending to coordinate the evening schedule. I gave Jason a weak, confused smile as he pulled out my chair. I sat down heavily, letting out a loud, ragged sigh that echoed through the quiet room. The trap was perfectly set, and I knew every single eye was fixed directly on me. The first course was served, and the psychological warfare officially commenced. I picked up my heavy crystal wine glass, making sure my fingers were visibly shaking. As I brought the glass toward my mouth, I deliberately allowed my wrist to spasm. The heavy crystal slipped through my fingers and crashed down onto the table. Dark red wine exploded across the pristine white tablecloth, splashing onto the expensive porcelain plates and staining the cuffs of my crisp dress shirt. Several guests gasped in shock. Waiters rushed forward with white towels to frantically clean the spreading mess. Jason looked absolutely mortified, his eyes darting around the room as he quietly apologized to the surrounding guests. I slumped back in my chair, putting my hands over my face, loudly muttering that my hands simply would not listen to my brain anymore. I sounded exactly like a terrified, helpless old man losing total control over his own physical body. Jason knelt beside my chair, placing a comforting hand on my knee, softly telling me that everything was going to be perfectly fine. But then I looked up and executed the most painful part of my performance. I stared directly at Valerie, narrowing my eyes in feigned aggressive confusion. I asked her in a loud, slurred voice what she was doing sitting next to my son. I aggressively demanded to know where Vanessa was completely fabricating a name to show severe cognitive disorientation. I loudly asked Jason why he had brought a total stranger to our private family dinner instead of his actual fiancée. The entire dining room descended into absolute, suffocating silence. Jason looked at me with pure, unfiltered devastation in his eyes. He slowly stood up, his voice cracking, as he softly reminded me that her name was Valerie. Valerie immediately stood up from her chair and rushed over to us. She placed her soft hand gently over my trembling fingers, putting on a masterful display of heartbreaking sympathy for the audience. She softly told Jason that it was completely okay, that the stress of the evening was simply confusing my fragile mind. But as she knelt there, projecting absolute angelic compassion, she briefly locked eyes with Rick standing across the room. I watched her perfectly manicured face. For a fraction of a second, the sweet facade dropped entirely. She exchanged a quick, triumphant smirk with her criminal husband. They were absolutely celebrating. My deeply humiliating performance had just publicly validated the forged medical dossier they planned to use against me. As the dinner finally drew to a close, I made a loud, clumsy show of needing to leave early. I felt incredibly exhausted and confused, claiming my head was swimming with strange shadows. He looked profoundly heartbroken as he walked me toward the heavy oak doors of the private dining room. I hugged my son tightly, whispering a genuine apology into his shoulder, an apology he completely misunderstood. I then turned toward the corner of the room where Rick was standing, organizing a stack of catering receipts. I shuffled slowly over to the man who was actively conspiring to lock me in a psychiatric ward. I reached out both of my trembling arms, telling him in a slurred, highly emotional voice how deeply grateful I was for everything he had done to make my son happy. I forcefully pulled him into a clumsy, lingering embrace. Rick stiffened in surprise, clearly disgusted by the physical contact with the frail old man he was destroying. As my arms wrapped around his broad shoulders, I smoothly slipped my right hand downward. With practiced silent precision, I dropped the micro-tracking device directly into the deep side pocket of his maroon suit jacket. I pulled away, gave him one confused smile, and shuffled out into the cold night air. I drove straight to the desolate service road where Victor was waiting inside the dark surveillance van. I climbed into the back, my heart pounding, as I stared at the glowing digital map on his monitor. At exactly midnight, the red dot suddenly moved. It traveled rapidly across the city grid, finally stopping in a dark, narrow alleyway located directly behind a closed commercial pharmacy. Victor typed a command to easily access the street cameras. Standing in the shadows, holding a briefcase, was the bribed neurologist. He wore an expensive camel hair overcoat and nervously checked his silver wristwatch every few seconds, completely unaware that a military-grade parabolic microphone was currently aimed directly at his chest. From the back of our dark surveillance van, Victor and I watched the digital feed with held breath. Rick walked into the frame a moment later. He moved with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he had just successfully conquered the world. He pulled a thick, unmarked brown envelope from the inner pocket of his maroon suit jacket and handed it directly to the anxious doctor. The highly sensitive audio equipment picked up their hushed conversation with terrifying clarity. Rick let out a low, cruel laugh, telling the doctor that my performance at the rehearsal dinner was absolutely flawless. He boasted that I had spilled wine all over myself and publicly forgot the name of the bride, perfectly setting the stage for the final medical evaluation. The doctor nervously clutched the heavy envelope to his chest. He asked Rick if the final dosage of the sedative had been properly prepared for tomorrow. Rick confidently replied that Valerie was mixing it into a strong cup of morning coffee as they spoke. He told the doctor to wait by his phone at 9 o'clock the following morning. Jason would call in a state of absolute panic, and the doctor would simply arrive, deliver the prepared psychiatric assessment, and signal the medical transport team to take me away forever. With the final transaction officially completed, Rick turned around and confidently walked out of the dark alley, heading back toward the main street to hail a taxi. The corrupt neurologist remained behind for a brief moment. He opened his expensive leather briefcase, carefully placing the thick envelope of stolen cash inside, entirely relieved that his dirty work was finally done. He closed the latch with a sharp click and turned around to walk toward his luxury sedan parked at the far end of the service road. Victor looked at me and gave a single firm nod. The time for hiding in the shadows was over. We quietly slid open the side door of the surveillance van and stepped out into the freezing Chicago night. We moved quickly and silently, completely blocking the narrow exit path leading to the street. As the doctor approached, his expensive leather shoes crunching softly against the loose gravel, he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. He saw two dark figures standing squarely in his way. I stepped forward, stepping directly under the dim, flickering light of a broken street lamp so he could see my face clearly. I did not slouch my shoulders. I did not lean heavily on my wooden cane. I stood perfectly straight, projecting the terrifying authority of a man who had spent his entire life crushing aggressive corporate rivals. I looked the panicked doctor directly in the eyes and offered him a very calm, chillingly polite good evening. I formally introduced myself as William Kensington, the exact same man he had just legally diagnosed with severe, irreversible vascular dementia without ever actually examining me in a clinical setting. The blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His hands began to shake violently, causing his heavy leather briefcase to rattle against his leg. He took a clumsy step backward, his eyes darting wildly toward the brick walls as if searching for a hidden escape route. He aggressively demanded that we step aside and let him pass, threatening to call the police if we tried to harass him any further. Victor stepped forward, then moving with the cold, calculated precision of a veteran federal agent. He did not raise his voice. He simply reached into his dark jacket, pulled out a small digital tablet, and turned the screen around to face the trembling doctor. Playing on a continuous, undeniable loop was the high-definition video recording of him accepting the thick envelope of cash from a convicted federal con artist just 3 minutes prior. Victor calmly informed the doctor that the high-quality audio recording of their entire criminal conspiracy was currently being uploaded to a secure cloud server. Victor then introduced himself as a retired forensic investigator for the federal government. He leaned in close to the terrified neurologist and methodically laid out the catastrophic reality of his situation. Victor coldly explained that medical fraud, criminal conspiracy, and accepting illicit bribes to facilitate the unlawful institutionalization of a perfectly healthy American citizen carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in federal prison. He promised the doctor that before the sun even rose, his prestigious medical license would be permanently revoked, his lucrative private practice would be thoroughly raided by federal agents, and his entire life would be completely and utterly destroyed. The doctor stared at the glowing tablet, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a suffocated fish. The arrogant, wealthy professional who had casually sold my life away for a stack of cash completely broke down. He dropped to his knees right there on the cold, filthy gravel of the alleyway. He dropped his expensive briefcase, burying his face in his trembling hands, openly sobbing and begging for mercy. He frantically confessed everything. He admitted that Valerie had approached him 2 months ago with a highly sophisticated plan and a massive amount of stolen corporate funds. He confessed that she had provided the exact medical template and dictated the specific heavy sedatives to ensure my symptoms perfectly matched his fabricated psychiatric evaluation. I stared down at the weeping man, feeling absolutely no pity. I demanded that he open his briefcase and hand over the unredacted operational documents. The broken doctor scrambled desperately to comply. He popped the latches of his briefcase and pulled out a thick blue folder, handing it up to me with violently shaking hands. I opened the file and saw the original unredacted timeline of their sinister plot, complete with the direct contact numbers for the private medical transport team Valerie had hired. I told the doctor that if he ever wanted to see the outside of a prison cell again, he would disappear from the city tonight and never return. But as I turned to walk away, the weeping man suddenly grabbed the hem of my coat. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, warning me that taking the documents would not stop her. He frantically explained that Valerie was dangerously paranoid and had meticulously prepared for the possibility of being discovered. He revealed the ultimate terrifying trap she had built to ensure my absolute silence. He told me Valerie had established a highly secure digital dead man switch linked directly to the wedding ceremony timeline. If the police arrested her, or if the wedding was forcefully canceled before the vows were completed, her hidden server would automatically trigger. An automated encrypted email would immediately dispatch a massive cache of fabricated financial documents straight to the federal authorities. These documents contained Jason's forged digital signature on completely falsified offshore accounts, perfectly framing my son for massive federal wire fraud. I stood in the freezing alleyway, digesting the sheer magnitude of Valerie's dead man switch. She had engineered an absolute checkmate. The terrified neurologist trembled violently on his knees, clutching his empty leather briefcase against his chest, as if it could somehow protect him from the inevitable collapse of his life. I looked down at him with profound, absolute disgust. I ordered him to give me every single physical copy of the forged medical dossier and the solitary confinement admission forms he had brought with him. He frantically dug into his coat pockets, handing over a thick stack of papers bearing my name and his fraudulent signature. I told him to get out of my sight and to leave the city immediately, warning him that if I ever saw his cowardly face again, the federal authorities would receive the video of his illicit transaction before he could even pack a suitcase. The broken man scrambled to his feet, slipping on the loose gravel, and sprinted away into the dark night without looking back. Victor and I returned to the cramped surveillance van. The digital monitors glowed brightly in the confined space, casting long shadows over the evidence we had just collected. The victory of turning the corrupt doctor was entirely eclipsed by the terrifying reality of the automated email server. If we simply called the police and had Valerie and Rick arrested, right now, the dead man switch would instantly activate. The federal government would receive a mountain of perfectly forged financial documents, and Jason would be aggressively prosecuted for massive corporate wire fraud. We were entirely trapped. The wedding was scheduled to begin in less than 10 hours, and any conventional attack would completely destroy my only child. I told Victor to pack up his equipment and go home to rest. The heavy lifting in the digital shadows was finally complete, and the remaining battle required a strictly legal maneuver. I drove my unmarked sedan back to my quiet suburban house. The dashboard clock read 3:15 in the morning. I walked into my dark study, turned on a single desk lamp, and poured myself a small glass of water. My mind raced through decades of complex commercial real estate law, searching for any possible loophole that could neutralize a dead man switch triggered by forged financial documents. Valerie had structured the trap beautifully. She knew the federal authorities always followed the paper trail, and she had meticulously ensured that every single devastating wire transfer and leveraged property loan bore the authentic executive authorization. If the automated email exposed the theft, Jason was the only legal target. The only way to stop the federal government from throwing my son in a penitentiary was to completely remove his legal liability. I had to fundamentally change the narrative of the crime before the crime was ever reported. I picked up my secure mobile phone and dialed my corporate attorney, Jonathan Reed, for the second time in 24 hours. I apologized for waking him again, but I told him I needed him at my house at exactly 5:15 in the morning with his official notary seal and his recording equipment. Jonathan arrived promptly at 5:15. The sky outside my window was just beginning to turn a pale, bruised purple. He carried his heavy leather briefcase and looked deeply exhausted, his tie loosened around his collar. I ushered him into my study and offered him a strong cup of black coffee. I sat across from him and laid out the new horrifying complication. I explained the automated dead man switch and the forged documents designed to frame my son for federal wire fraud the moment the police intervened. Jonathan rubbed his tired eyes, his professional composure faltering for a brief moment. He quietly stated that if those documents reached the federal authorities, defending Jason would be an absolute legal nightmare. The paper trail was simply too strong, and the sheer volume of the stolen millions would trigger an aggressive prosecution. I looked my old friend directly in the eyes and told him we were not going to defend Jason in federal court. We were going to stop the case from ever existing in the first place. I instructed Jonathan to draft a highly specific, legally binding corporate confession, along with a comprehensive assumption of absolute liability. I was going to legally absorb every single disastrous financial transaction my son had made over the past 3 weeks. Jonathan stopped writing and stared at me in profound shock. He warned me that by signing a document of that magnitude, I was voluntarily taking on the crushing legal weight of multi-million-dollar embezzlement. I calmly corrected him. I was the founder and majority shareholder of Kensington Properties. If I retroactively claimed that I had personally authorized and directed Jason to execute those massive wire transfers and leverage those commercial buildings, it was no longer corporate fraud. It was simply a terrible business decision made by a stubborn owner. The federal authorities could not prosecute an executive for wire fraud if the owner of the company provided sworn, notarized testimony validating the transactions. By absorbing the liability, I was rendering the automated dead man switch completely inert. Valerie could send 1,000,000 emails to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but the documents would be meaningless if I legally owned the debt. Jonathan frantically typed on his laptop, drafting the complex liability transfer. He warned me that to make this maneuver legally sound and completely insulate the blind trust we had established the night before we had to take one final devastating step, we had to completely liquidate his personal equity and absorb his entire executive portfolio to cover the massive financial losses I was formally assuming. I told Jonathan to proceed with the liquidation without a single moment of hesitation. I understood the severe consequences of this aggressive legal action perfectly. By absorbing the crushing debt and stripping his equity to balance the corporate ledgers, I was legally bankrupting my own son. Every single dollar in his personal bank accounts, the sprawling glass penthouse I had purchased for him, his luxury vehicles, and his entire executive salary were completely wiped out. The legal documents slowly printed from the small machine on my massive wooden desk, warm and heavy with the terrible weight of absolute destruction. I took my favorite fountain pen and signed my name on every designated line, while Jonathan officially stamped each page with his heavy notary seal. I was executing a financial demolition that would leave my only child with absolutely nothing to his name. It was a brutal, agonizing decision, but it was the only way to save his freedom. By taking the blame, I had successfully disarmed the dead man switch and secured his future outside of a prison cell. More importantly, I had completely neutralized the very reason the wedding was taking place. Jason was now a penniless man. Valerie was putting on her expensive white dress, preparing to walk down a lavish aisle, entirely unaware that she was about to marry a man who possessed absolutely nothing for her to steal. The trap was finally armed. The morning sun cast a bright golden light over the magnificent sprawling estate of the Crystal Pavilion. I parked my car in the far corner of the massive lot, taking a deep breath before stepping out into the crisp air. Today was the day my son was supposed to tie the knot, surrounded by hundreds of prominent guests, influential board members, and a carefully curated selection of Chicago elite. I walked slowly toward the grand entrance, leaving my heavy wooden cane resting completely forgotten on the passenger seat of my vehicle. I absolutely did not need it anymore. The frail, confused old man who spilled wine and slurred his words had vanished the moment the legal documents were finalized in the freezing warehouse. As I approached the main glass doors, the muffled sounds of classical music drifted through the air. The venue was packed with people dressed in their absolute best, smiling and exchanging polite conversation. I stepped inside the grand foyer and immediately noticed the stark contrast between the glamorous guest list and the cheap synthetic floral centerpieces decorating the tables. Valerie had secretly pocketed the massive wedding budget, leaving behind a hollow imitation of a true luxury event. I moved silently through the crowded room, keeping to the shadows along the outer walls, so I would not draw unnecessary attention. I spotted Jason standing near the grand altar at the far end of the ballroom. He was wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, looking incredibly handsome, but visibly nervous. He kept shifting his weight from side to side, fixing his silk tie and looking down the long white aisle. My heart ached painfully in my chest as I watched my only child. He believed he was standing on the absolute peak of the world, preparing to marry a sophisticated European heiress who would solidify his elite status. He had absolutely no idea that as he stood there in his expensive suit, his personal bank accounts were completely empty. He did not know that his sprawling glass penthouse and luxury vehicles had been legally stripped from his name just hours prior. By legally absorbing his massive corporate debt to shield him from federal prison, I had rendered him totally penniless. He was an executive in name, only standing at the grand altar with nothing but the clothes on his back, waiting for a bride who only wanted his money. I forced myself to look away from my son. I had a final mission to execute, and I could not afford to let my emotions compromise my focus. I turned away from the main crowded ballroom and walked down the long carpeted corridor leading directly to the private bridal suites. The heavy oak doors were guarded by a single venue attendant, but I flashed him a confident, authoritative look, and he immediately stepped aside, assuming I was simply a proud father going to give the bride a final blessing. I reached out and grasped the cool brass handle of the master suite. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped quietly into the luxurious room. Valerie was standing in the very center of the plush carpet, admiring her reflection in a massive floor-to-ceiling gilded mirror. She was wearing a stunning, custom-designed wedding gown that cost $40,000, undoubtedly paid for using the funds she had maliciously siphoned from my corporate treasury. Her thick, dark hair was perfectly styled, her professional makeup completely flawless. She looked like the absolute epitome of a wealthy, deeply innocent bride, preparing for the happiest, most romantic day of her entire life. She heard the soft click of the door closing behind me and spoke without turning around. She assumed I was Rick, returning with a status update on their sinister medical trap. She casually asked if the corrupt doctor was in position and ready to declare my mind completely gone once the ceremony concluded. I did not answer her question. I stood perfectly still, letting the heavy, suffocating silence fill the luxurious bridal suite. When she did not receive a response, she let out an annoyed sigh and spun around, a sharp reprimand ready on her lips. The moment her dark eyes locked onto my face, the annoyed expression vanished, replaced by an initial flash of mild surprise. She expected to see a heavily sedated, stumbling old man, barely able to comprehend his own surroundings. But I was not slouching. My shoulders were squared, my posture was perfectly straight, and my eyes were sharp, calculated, and completely lucid. I looked at her with the cold intensity of a man who had spent half a century crushing ruthless corporate enemies. The color slowly drained from her painted face as her brilliant calculating mind desperately tried to process the impossible sight before her. She took a slow, hesitant step backward, her expensive white gown rustling softly against the carpet. I watched the profound realization wash over her features. The heavy tranquilizers she had poured into my herbal tea had completely failed. The toxic cocktail designed to mimic aggressive vascular dementia had not compromised my brain. The entire foundation of her flawless medical trap had just evaporated into thin air. She desperately tried to recover her composure, forcing a tight, artificial smile onto her trembling lips. She asked what I was doing in her private suite, her voice shaking slightly, despite her best efforts to sound sweet and concerned. I did not return her smile. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps towards her, closing the distance between us. I told her the theatrical performance was officially over. I told her I knew her name was Veronica. I told her I knew about the abandoned warehouse in Nevada, the fake European trust, and the convicted federal con artist currently posing as her flamboyant wedding planner. The tight, artificial smile instantly shattered, falling away, to reveal the hardened, ruthless predator hiding underneath the expensive white silk. Her dark eyes narrowed into venomous slits of pure hatred. She realized her grand illusion was completely ruined. She dropped the elegant European accent entirely, her voice turning harsh and deeply vicious. She aggressively marched toward me, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. She screamed that I was a pathetic old fool, declaring that even if I knew the truth, she still controlled my son and the corporate accounts. She told me I could never stop the wedding because Jason would defend her blindly against my wild accusations. Her arrogance was absolutely staggering. She genuinely believed her automated dead man switch still held my entire corporate empire hostage. She believed I was trapped. She took another aggressive step forward, her face contorted with rage, and delivered her final desperate command. She shouted at the top of her lungs, "Get out of here and don't come back. You're not welcome here." I looked at the vicious 42-year-old woman standing before me, knowing that in exactly 3 minutes, her entire world was going to violently collapse into dust. I smiled my cold, calculated smile, looking her directly in the eyes. I replied in a perfectly calm, unwavering voice, "Okay, Valerie, but I'll take some others with me." I turned my back on her and walked slowly out of the luxurious bridal suite, stepping back into the brightly lit corridor. I did not rush. I moved with the steady, measured pace of a man who held the absolute power to dictate the future. Valerie chased right after me, her heavy silk dress swishing furiously against the carpeted floor. She was completely frantic now, completely losing the polished European persona she had spent months perfecting. She hissed demands at my back, threatening to call security and have me forcibly removed from the premises, entirely oblivious to the fact that she was currently marching directly into a perfectly orchestrated federal ambush. I stepped out into the main ballroom, where hundreds of distinguished guests were seated in perfect rows, waiting for the grand ceremony to begin. The soft classical music was still playing from the string quartet, positioned near the front. Jason was standing at the altar, looking incredibly nervous, his eyes darting between me and his furious bride. I walked down the center of the long white aisle, stopping exactly in the middle of the enormous room. I turned to face the altar, looked directly into my son's confused eyes, and calmly raised my right hand into the air. The ultimate payoff unfolded with the devastating precision of falling dominoes. The moment my hand went up, the classical music abruptly stopped. The older, dignified priest standing right next to Jason at the grand altar suddenly closed his heavy leather-bound Bible with a sharp, echoing thud. He stepped down from the elevated platform, reaching into the inner pocket of his sacred vestments. He did not pull out a cross or a marriage certificate. He pulled out a solid gold federal shield. I was an undercover agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and his commanding voice immediately filled the silent room, instructing all authorized personnel to secure the perimeter. At that exact command, The elite catering staff positioned around the perimeter of the ballroom stopped their movements entirely. The men and women carrying silver trays of expensive champagne abruptly placed them down onto the tables. They reached beneath their black aprons, pulling out identification, lanyards, and digital tablets. They were not catering staff. They were elite forensic auditors and federal investigators who had been secretly gathering physical evidence of wire fraud throughout the venue all morning. The wealthy guests seated on the groom's side of the aisle suddenly began to move. These were not random socialites or distant relatives. They were my deeply loyal, highly experienced board of directors, the exact same men who had stood beside me in that freezing warehouse to legally dismantle my son's executive authority. In total absolute unison, 36 of the most powerful commercial real estate tycoons in Chicago stood up from their velvet chairs. They did not say a single word. They simply buttoned their expensive suit jackets, turned their backs on the grand altar, and began marching silently toward the main exit. The synchronized movement was incredibly powerful and profoundly humiliating. They were formally withdrawing their respect and their presence, leaving Jason entirely isolated in a sea of empty white chairs. Valerie stood frozen at the back of the aisle, her jaw dropping open as she watched the entire illusion of her high society wedding disintegrating before her very eyes. She desperately reached for her hidden burner phone, her fingers trembling as she prepared to manually trigger her catastrophic dead man switch to frame my son. But before she could even unlock the digital screen, the heavy double doors at the back of the grand ballroom violently burst open. 4 heavily armed federal agents marched into the room. Dragging between them, struggling and cursing loudly, was the man from the mugshot. Rick, the convicted federal con artist who had been posing as her flamboyant wedding planner, was currently wearing a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. His bright maroon suit was torn, and his face was twisted in absolute panic. The agents shoved him forward, bringing him directly past Valerie. She stared at her legal husband in pure, unadulterated horror. She realized in that exact moment that her digital safety net was completely gone. Her encrypted servers had been seized. The corrupt neurologist had confessed everything. The dead man switch she relied on to control my son was completely useless because I had already legally bankrupted him. She had spent months executing a flawless financial heist, only to realize she was standing in the middle of a federal trap with absolutely nothing to show for it. Valerie let out a piercing, agonizing scream of absolute defeat that echoed violently against the high glass ceilings of the pavilion. It was not the elegant cry of a heartbroken bride. It was the feral, desperate shriek of a cornered predator realizing it was about to spend the rest of its natural life inside a federal penitentiary. I ignored her screaming completely and continued walking slowly down the remaining length of the white aisle. I approached the grand altar where my son was standing. Jason was entirely paralyzed. His face was completely devoid of color, and his eyes were wide with a profound, shattering trauma. He watched the federal agents actively securing the exits and reading Valerie her Miranda rights in the distance, totally unable to comprehend how his perfect romantic dream had instantly transformed into a massive criminal crime scene. He looked at me, his lips trembling silently, begging for an explanation. I did not offer him comforting words or a warm embrace. I reached inside my dark suit jacket and pulled out the thick, unredacted dossier Victor had compiled. I placed the heavy stack of official documents directly into my son's shaking hands. I spoke to him in a voice that was perfectly steady, devoid of anger, but completely empty of any softness. I told him to look closely at the papers he was holding. I explained that the woman screaming in the back of the room was not a 29-year-old European tech heiress. I told him she was a 42-year-old career criminal named Veronica, who was currently legally married to the handcuffed man being dragged out the door. Jason stared down at the criminal records, the marriage certificates, and the authentic mugshots. His breath hitched in his throat as the undeniable evidence shattered his entire reality. I did not stop there. I pointed to the final document in the thick stack. I calmly told him that it was a forged medical dossier and a solitary confinement admission form for a maximum security psychiatric ward. I explained that his beautiful bride had spent $200,000 of our corporate money to ensure that tomorrow morning I would be heavily sedated, legally declared incompetent, and permanently locked inside a padded room so she could steal his entire fortune. I watched the final horrifying realization slowly wash over his deeply shocked, pale face, completely breaking his spirit from the inside out. He finally understood that he had almost traded his devoted father for a brilliantly disguised nightmare. The beautiful illusion was gone, leaving only the devastating, incredibly bitter truth behind. Jason slowly and painfully dropped the heavy stack of forged medical documents onto the carpeted floor of the grand altar. His hands were shaking so violently he could no longer physically maintain his firm grip on the undeniable evidence of his own destruction. He fell heavily to his knees, the sharp crease of his tailored tuxedo pants buckling against the white fabric of the aisle runner. For the first time in his privileged life, my son was completely speechless, his chest heaving as he gasped for air in the center of the massive, empty ballroom. At the very back of the massive venue, the loud, chaotic scene of absolute federal justice was actively unfolding with incredibly brutal and relentless efficiency. Valerie was not going quietly. The sophisticated European heiress had completely vanished, replaced by the desperate feral criminal she truly was. As the two federal agents moved in to secure her wrists, she began to thrash wildly. She screamed vile, ear-piercing obscenities that echoed violently off the high glass ceilings. She kicked her expensive heels against the marble floor, tearing the delicate lace of her $40,000 custom wedding gown in the process. The agents forcefully pinned her arms behind her back, and the sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs, snapping shut, sounded like music to my ears. She was violently dragged out through the heavy double doors, her mascara running down her face in dark streaks. Right behind her, local law enforcement officers were escorting the hired theatrical actors who had played her billionaire parents out of the building. They were babbling frantically, trying to explain that they had simply been hired for a corporate acting gig and had no idea they were participating in a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy. The agents ignored their desperate pleas. Rick, the previously convicted con artist, was already securely locked in the very back of a heavily armored black federal transport vehicle actively waiting in the sprawling parking lot. I turned my attention entirely back to the broken young man kneeling on the floor. I walked slowly up the short steps of the grand altar and stood directly over him. I did not reach out to touch his shoulder. I did not offer him a warm, forgiving embrace. Jason looked up at me, his face completely wet with tears, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for paternal comfort. He wept openly, sobbing that he was incredibly sorry for everything he had done. He choked on his words, telling me he genuinely believed he was building a beautiful future. He assumed my wealth would automatically erase his severe consequences. I looked down at him, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely unreadable. I spoke to him in a voice that was perfectly calm, carrying the heavy, immovable weight of absolute authority. I told Jason I had already fixed the most dangerous part of his mess. I explained the midnight meeting in the freezing industrial warehouse. I told him about the irrevocable blind trust, the emergency boardroom coup, and the massive legal documents I had signed just hours before sunrise. I watched his tear-streaked face pale even further as I calmly informed him that I had legally absorbed every single one of his fraudulent commercial loans and disastrous wire transfers. I had successfully neutralized the automated dead man switch, but then I delivered the final sobering consequence of his absolute freedom. I told my son that in order to balance the corporate ledgers and legally insulate the company from his catastrophic vulnerability, I had to liquidate his entire personal executive portfolio. I told him that his sprawling glass penthouse was currently being repossessed. I told him that his luxury vehicles were gone and that every single dollar in his personal checking and savings accounts had been completely zeroed out, Jason stared up at me, the devastating reality of total bankruptcy, crushing the last remaining breath from his lungs. I was a completely penniless man. He asked me, his voice trembling with sheer panic, what he was supposed to do now. I did not flinch at his desperation. I looked my son directly in the eyes and delivered the hardest truth a father can ever give. I told him that a man must learn how to rebuild his own house when he is the one who recklessly burns it to the ground. I told him that for his entire life he had lived comfortably inside an impenetrable fortress, constructed entirely by my sweat, my sacrifices, and my calloused hands. Because I had always protected him from the harsh elements of the real world, he had grown soft, arrogant, and dangerously susceptible to the flattering lies of a seasoned predator. If he wanted to be a part of my life and my empire, he was going to have to earn it from the absolute bottom. 1 full year has passed since the morning that fake wedding shattered into pieces. Jason did not get his luxurious corner office back. He works 5 days a week at the primary industrial distribution warehouse on the south side of Chicago, the exact same warehouse where I started my commercial real estate business nearly 50 years ago. He clocks in at 6 o'clock every morning, wearing a faded high-visibility vest and heavy steel-toed boots. He operates a commercial forklift, moving heavy pallets of raw construction materials across the dusty concrete floor, earning a standard hourly wage. He lives in a very modest apartment that he pays for himself. The consistently grueling, demanding physical labor has fundamentally and permanently humbled his previously unshakable arrogance. As for Valerie and Rick, the federal justice system was absolutely merciless. The mountain of concrete digital evidence Victor and I handed over to the authorities was completely undeniable. The forged medical documents, the illicit bribery of the corrupt neurologist, and the massive interstate wire fraud guaranteed them both incredibly lengthy sentences. Valerie is currently serving 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely stripped of her designer clothes and her fabricated European aristocracy. She will spend the remainder of her youth sitting in a cold concrete cell. A very fitting punishment for a woman who tried to lock an innocent father inside a psychiatric ward for the rest of his natural life. I am 76 years old now. I stepped back into the demanding role of chief executive officer to permanently steady the corporate ship. This evening, I am sitting quietly on the wrap around wooden porch of my suburban home. The evening air is wonderfully crisp, quiet, and perfectly cool. I hold a steaming porcelain mug in my hands, taking a long, slow sip of fresh, strong, entirely unpoisoned dark roast coffee. I calmly watch the intensely beautiful orange and vibrant purple colors of the glorious sunset slowly descend over the remarkably quiet Chicago skyline directly in the far distance. The profound peace that surrounds me is not just the absence of conflict. It is the deep settling and profound satisfaction of a man who looked pure evil directly in the eyes and completely refused to blink, reclaiming his life. A father's love is often silent, but you must never mistake that silence for blindness or weakness. When a man spends his entire life building an empire and protecting his family, he develops an instinct that no scammer can outsmart. Greed thrives in the dark, feeding on manipulation and lies, but truth always carries a heavy, blinding light. The ultimate tragedy is not losing your money, but losing your moral compass to vanity. True lasting wealth is only earned through hard work, and a family's bond should never be sacrificed on the altar of superficial status or completely deceptive appearances. Did William do the right thing by making Jason start over from the bottom, or was he too harsh on his son? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more incredible life stories. See you next time.